Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time of day it is. Thank you for tuning in to Conversations with Dr. Don. Now, for your first-time viewers, Conversations with Dr. Don is an ongoing series of one-hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting people like most of you out there about who they are as unique, one-of-a-kind individuals and about whatever it is we have decided to talk about. And the title of tonight's show is The Democratic Socialists of America in Oregon. We're trying to find a title that will fit what we'll be talking about because the DSA in Oregon has been sort of quiet for some years, but we're going to be talking about bringing it back, and let's just go with that. Steve Weiss over here, who's been on the show 3,000 times over the past 10 years. Steve is a good friend of mine, a democratic socialist, and progressive populist. Does that fit for you?
Yeah.
Yeah. And his compatriot here is Rhys. Did I say it right?
That's right, yeah.
And this is your first time on the show.
It is.
And I want you to know that occasionally I ask an unexpected question, and it always troubles my guests. So you ready for
I'm ready. I'm ready.
So I'm a little nervous, as I usually am when we start a show. And I feel okay now. It takes about 30 or 40 seconds for me to calm down and get with what's going on here, because I pretty well shifted the gear, and I'm curious about what it is that you're going to say to me so I can say something back to you, and we'll go back and forth. We might let Steve talk. Never mind. First half of the show is what I call the bio segment, where we talk about who you are personally, so the viewers have an idea where you're coming from when you have an opinion or a view about whatever we'll be talking about at the time. Of course, we'll be talking about DSA and items related to it, and you did send me a cheat sheet with a few questions, so I don't have to pull these from the top of my head.
Okay.
And let's find out who you are first. So let's start with Steve, because Steve has done it before. Shall we, Steve?
Who am I?
Yeah.
I'm an advocate and activist. Some of the things I do out there, I'm board president of the Oregon State Council for Retired Citizens.
Will you say that again?
The Oregon State Council for Retired Citizens.
Yes.
We're the only senior organization in the state that endorses political candidates. We have our own political action committee, and I'm president of that too. I'm board president of Independent Living Resources. ILR is the largest center for independent living for people with disabilities in Oregon. I am term limiting off 2 years as chair of the Multnomah Elders in Action Commission. I'm a founding board member of the Community Alliance of Tenants. I serve on the board of United Seniors of Oregon.
And this is all in Portland?
All in Portland.
Mm-hmm.
I chair Health Share of Oregon's Community Advisory Council, and that gets me a seat on the Health Share of Oregon Board of Directors. Health Share of Oregon is all about the state's health transformation process, which at this point is affecting the 600,000 Oregon Health Plan Medicaid recipients in Oregon. And I'll stop there, Don, because there's a lot more, and I don't want to take up a whole lot of time.
I know. Knowing you, it'll take 2 hours more. Do you ever sleep?
You know, the truth of the matter is, I don't know that I've ever slept well. I've had insomnia problems since I was a kid. But in many ways, I probably sleep better now than I did when I was younger, because I don't have the pressures on me now than I did when I was younger, and that's good.
And those organizations which you're president and an officer, and you say you have no pressures on you, what about your responsibilities for all those do-good organizations you belong to?
You know, it's taken me a long time to say this, but I'm good at what I do, and it helps. Sometimes I feel inadequate, but the truth of the matter is that when I can look at it clearly, I do a good job, and the people who know me think I do a good job. And that's kind of nice, considering I'm 70 years old now.
70. How are you feeling about it at this moment?
I'm feeling okay.
Yeah. Rhys, how are you feeling?
I'm feeling great.
Okay.
Great. I'm glad to be here.
You're not nervous?
I am not, no. You make it very comfortable to be here.
I'm trying to make you nervous.
Okay, all right. I'll try harder.
Yeah. Let's go back to Steve for a minute.
Okay.
And you were born where and when?
I was born in January 1943 in New York City, in the Bronx specifically.
I never know by your accent. Trick question. Why were you born?
Honestly, don't know. I don't even know if my mother's pregnancy with me was planned. It probably was not. She actually had an abortion before she was pregnant with me, a couple of years before. Very unusual. This was 1940-41. But you know, in New York City, there was always a local abortionist, particularly among lower-income folks. That's usually true of most major American urban areas, particularly at that time. But they had me, and I don't know, for most of my life I was glad about that. But I've had a life for the last 18 years, and in many ways I did not have a life before then. And the life I've had in the last 18 years has been pretty good.
Okay. Anything significant about your racial or cultural heritage worth repeating or saying something about?
Well, I consider myself a secular Jew. We actually have a tradition within Judaism of secularism, of non-religious Jews. It's part of what makes us unique, and it's part of what's fueled anti-Semitism over a long period of time. The other thing that's fueled it is that Jews have always been overrepresented in every movement of the political left in the world for probably 300 years.
Why do you suppose that is?
I think we have an ethical background, particularly in regard to texts like the Talmud. We care about justice. Jews for centuries have debated what constitutes justice, and the Talmud is very much about that. I think that's one of the reasons why. The other is that for centuries we were an oppressed people. We've assimilated into this country to the point where the founders of the neoconservative movement in America were mostly Jewish. The Commentary Magazine crowd, Norman Podhoretz, Mitch Dechter, Ben Wattenberg, and so on. I mean, it's anathema to me, because I come, it's not that my parents were particularly left-wing, although one of my grandparents was, but I feel that I'm part of a left-wing progressive tradition. And to see neoconservatism founded by another part of Judaism that gives me fits is difficult, and it has been difficult for the last 30 or 40 years now.
Why do you think that's true, what you just said?
Why did that evolve?
It evolved that way. You have the Podhoretz.
I fear that every immigrant group to this country, if they're here long enough, winds up assimilating. And I think we're going to see the same thing happen, if it isn't already happening, among African Americans, among Latinos. We're already seeing the likes of Ted Cruz. I mean, you know, it's an unfortunate thing. It's what this country and its traditions do to people.
Say a few words about Ted Cruz so the viewers will know who you're talking about.
He is the senator from Texas, I believe, and he's an idiot.
No, Steve, you're supposed to be charitable.
I have to be honest here rather than charitable. And so, yeah.
Let's say a few words about your education, your formal education.
Well, the only formal education I have is that I have a bachelor's degree in English from what was then California State College at Los Angeles, is now California State University at Los Angeles. So that's my formal education. I've done a lot of reading in my life, and college gave me the tools to do analytical reading. It's not something I came to college with. K through 12 for me mostly in the New York City school system, and a couple of years ago, believe it or not, in the San Gabriel Valley in Southern California.
I know it well.
Were an absolute waste. I mean, I still don't think very much of K through 12. We don't teach people how to think rationally and analytically, how to read an article and determine what's opinion and what's fact, and how to differentiate between the two.
What do they teach? What do we teach our citizenry instead of how to think and those kinds of things that are useful?
Basically, conformity. I mean, Robert Lindner, who was a psychologist many years ago, wrote a book in the 50s called Must You Conform? And it was one of the first books that questioned conformity in America. And really, what is junior high school and high school in particular, but ways of teaching us how to stop thinking and try to be well-liked. We teach everybody to be Willie Loman's, the main character in Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, who, for him, being liked wasn't good enough. He wanted to be well-liked, and one way you can be well-liked is to conform, and it still happens in this country.
What did you do to earn your keep until 18 years ago, all these years?
Not much, to tell you the truth. I was on disability from 1991 onward, and that's probably the steadiest income I ever had. But for most people, disability is a dead end. For me, it was a new beginning.
Really? Will you say a few words about your disability, if it's appropriate now?
Well, I applied on the basis of anxiety-related disorders, but the truth of the matter is I've suffered from chronic migraine headaches all my life.
Oh
Last
my
year,
God.
183 days worth. And how I survived my first 52 years with that now seems to me to be a source of amazement, because I don't think I fully realized what I went through until a breakthrough drug came on the market back in 1994. These drugs are called triptan drugs.
Yeah.
And Imitrex, the generic name is sumatriptan, has enabled my advocacy career for 18 years now. I now have a drug to take if I feel a migraine coming on, and know that an hour or two later I will be okay if I go to a meeting. That has changed my life.
But all those years before that,
It was very difficult.
oh man, baptism of fire or something.
And anxiety has to come with that, except in 1990 when I applied for disability, there was no way you could get on disability because of chronic migraines. And so you go with your best chance, you know, in regard to that.
Wow. And you have a partner, a boyfriend, girlfriend, wife, husband, one of those things?
No girlfriend right now. I'm looking.
You hear that out there? He's available, girls. Okay. We're political persuasion. We know you've fallen off the left end of the continuum, so I won't ask you anything about that. And we've talked about memberships in civic organizations, and we can go on for another hour about that. But your whole life is being involved in those kinds of organizations that are concerned about justice and fair treatment and taking care of our citizenry and fellow human beings. And you feel good about that.
Yes. Yes.
Christ, yeah.
I really feel it's a privilege to do the volunteer work that I do.
Persons from the past or alive today that you admire or look up to, any names come to mind?
Eugene Debs, Noam Chomsky, Tony Benn in England, Francis Fox Piven, and Barbara Ehrenreich, who also happen to be members of Democratic Socialism.
I was waiting for him to finish that.
Lillian Hellman, at least in her writings. Oh, gosh. Well, those are openers anyway.
You got it, yeah. Shall we move over to Rhys?
Okay.
Ready?
Sure.
And tell me your full name again. You told me before the show started, but I want to hear it again.
Rhys is my middle name, and that's what I always have gone by with the Welsh spelling, although my first name is actually Charles, and my last name's Scholes, so I'm Charles Rhys Scholes.
Uh-huh. Do you like that name?
I do. I particularly like how I'm mostly known as Rhys. I've always liked writing on a name tag. You know, you go to a meeting, you write it on a name tag, four-letter name, and it's unique. Nobody else. I mean, now there's more now but I think I'm the 365th most popular name in the U.S. now for babies born last year. But RHYS, it's a conversation starter. Although in my entire school career, I never had a school teacher who pronounced it right the first time. It was a big zero.
So I don't feel bad by having a hard time.
No, everybody has a hard time with it. Although it's becoming more common. And if you go to Wales or even in England, people in England, because there's a lot of Welsh people around, usually don't know how to pronounce it.
Uh-huh. If I were to ask your best friend, who is Rhys? What would your best friend say? He or she would say, Rhys is what?
I think my friends view me as an...
Say it in the first person. Pretend you're that person. Rhys is...
Rhys is an activist who seems to get involved in doing creative stuff for social change. I think he's done a lot of that stuff over the... People who've known me for a long time say, oh, he was that guy who did those skits. He's that guy who... you know, gave the fundraising pitch at the rally. You know, I was, for many years, people thought of me as this. That's where they saw me, as I was the folks who asked them to look in your pocket and find a picture of Abraham Lincoln and help Abraham Lincoln get involved in social action today by putting him in this hat that's coming by you. So that was one of my trademarks. Although I was also well known for my as a character called Anal Roberts, who performed in some late night skits about religious fundamentalism in the right wing. So,
yes.
So those are some of my reputations.
Okay, and when and where were you born?
I was born in 1953. I turned 60 this month in Montclair, New Jersey, which is outside of New York City. Mm-hmm. My mother was a native New Yorker. Her parents were Welsh immigrants, but at the time I was born, and my father was at that point what we would now call a madman. He was an advertising writer, worked on Madison Avenue, and commuted into the city. My father, I've been an environmentalist for an awful long time, and I have to say my father got his start in the advertising industry. He was from Nebraska. He wrote the radio spots for DDT. He introduced DDT and would write these radio spots for the 4:30 a.m. Farm Report. Then he went on to write commercials for jet planes and Sprite and various other things. But soon after I was born, my family moved first to Miami and then to Georgia. And so most of my formative years were spent in Atlanta, Georgia, and Decatur, Georgia, which is real close to Atlanta. And I was there during the civil rights movement. I started kindergarten in a totally racially segregated school, and my school was integrated between my 6th and 7th grade year. More than half of the teachers quit rather than teach black students, and I went through the turmoil of the civil rights movement in Georgia, and that combined with my mother's politics. My mother voted for Norman Thomas for president 3 times, and her formative years were spent living in Greenwich Village and working for the Women's Prison Association in New York City, which was a Quaker settlement house sort of group that helped women prisoners. So the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I mean, my mom really had a lot of the politics that I have. So
your leftist credentials are pretty solid.
Yeah, she was much less politically involved than I've been. She had a strong political perspective, but she chose to be involved in other kinds of activities. But she shared, when I first came out as a socialist when I was in the 8th grade, because my mother had talked to me about socialism. And when I read the 8th grade social studies textbook that defined socialism, I said, oh, that's me, look, there I am.
So let's see about cultural heritage, racial, national. Anything about that would be worth
So
mentioning.
I'm really feel very tied to the Welsh national character. I'm 50% Welsh. My mother's parents were immigrants. They literally met on the boat coming over. My grandfather, my maternal grandfather, was the ship's engineer, and he could speak Welsh, and the captain had him go talk to this woman who was very unhappy, who only spoke Welsh. And next thing you know, there they were as part of this immigrant community in New York City. So, and one of the reasons why I think I'm attracted to Oregon so much, I've been here since 1976, is I see a lot of the Welsh, just the way that Wales is, and its relationship to England, and the way the West Coast is, and even the way the wind comes off the ocean to the west, you know, and it affects the way people treat each other in the pubs. And if you've been in pubs in Portland, you can go to pubs in Wales and fit right in. So I feel, so that's my father's side of the family is American back to pre-revolutionary times. I was actually just doing some research on my in-laws, and I did some research on my family too, and I could be a daughter of the American Revolution, I think, but except for a couple of shortcomings that I have there. But my father's family goes back all the way to that stuff. But I'm much more, and my father allegedly, there's a lot of stories in my father's family that are hard to keep track of, but my father was allegedly an 8th Cherokee, so I'm theoretically a 16th Cherokee. But there were a lot of stories in my father's family that I've since discovered were not entirely accurate, so I can't swear. I can't swear by that. I haven't been able to prove it yet. But
Usually when someone talks about their heritage, they talk about it in terms of this is it, this is what happened, and that's it, as though there were no wood piles or anything back in those days.
it is. I've been getting into this research a little bit, and boy, when you actually get the facts, which are now easier to get because the Mormons have done such a good job of collecting all this stuff, it's not at all. You know, it's not what Mama told you. It's things have been sterilized a little bit for the future generations.
Yeah, how about, do you have a religious preference today or not?
Well, I've been involved in religion a lot over the years. I was very involved in Presbyterianism. I was for a while a religion major in college, and I have not been involved in faith communities for these many years. But this year, for reasons I can't exactly explain, but this year I've been to 12 different churches, just sort of on an exploration, because I'm really interested in the potential for faith communities to be a real force for social change. So I thought I should go find out what the faith communities are doing. So, and it's really easy. I mean, I would encourage people who might think about this, is you just have to show up. You sit in the pew, you know, the whole thing goes on, and you really get an inside look at you know, the way some other people are, what's important to them, what are their fundamental values. So it's been very interesting. So
the faith community is worthwhile, including the Muslim Brotherhood?
I think that the variety of religious expression in our community is very wide, and a lot of people I certainly don't agree with. But I'm interested in the idea of what do people find most important. My parents were actually on the board of directors of the American Humanist Society in New York City with a guy named Charles Francis Potter in the 40s. So I've come from a variety, but then later on my mother was an elder in the Presbyterian Church. So that's another family thing, is we're all kind of out there looking around. And I for a long time consorted with the pagans. One of my proud moments was when the Portlandia sculpture was erected on the side of the Portland building.
Yes.
The Portland pagan community came together for a large ritual at midnight on a full moon night. I was there with several hundred people where Portlandia was consecrated as our municipal goddess. So with all the appropriate chants and everything. So I've been around the block on the spiritual issues.
Yeah. What does spiritual mean to you? People say I'm spiritual. What does that mean?
Well, I think about it in terms of highest values. There are people we know in the world who really are just about having more money or more power for themselves, and you could argue that that is their spiritual identity. But if we're about making the world a better place, like I think a lot of us are, I view that as sort of a spiritual value. I think people who have religions, you know, attach a symbol structure to that, but I don't think it's much more complicated than really what's the most important thing to you. You know, when push comes to shove, what's the bottom line? And that's where I find my connection with that.
So when you're feeling spiritual, you're feeling okay with yourself and okay with the world and okay with society and culture. And at the moment when you're thinking, this must be a spiritual feeling, are you feeling troubled, okay, anxious, or nervous, or just fine, or at peace, or what?
I think it's the full range of things. I think like many of my fellow Oregonians, some of my most spiritual experiences are in the natural world, in the Columbia Gorge or on top of a mountain, and I, you know, experience that whole thing and experience my connection to it. I think it's about the connection. But I think it's not just in moments of happiness. It's in moments of when things are really bad, and you ask, you know, so what's important that we respond in this moment? Well, I think that's, again, bringing up the spiritual values. I think I probably think about that in a different way than, you know, Wikipedia would say, but.
You're delightful to visit with. Yeah. And did we talk about your formal education at all?
No, I went to college in Memphis, Tennessee. I grew up in Georgia and went to Memphis, Tennessee, and that was at a little college that's now called Rhodes College. I describe it as a place it's a lot like Lewis and Clark, but it looks kind of like Reed. You know, it has those great, you know, Oxford kind of stone buildings, but it's really a place
a local Oregon educational places that you're mentioning, Reed and
Lewis and Clark. Yes, there and yeah, a little liberal arts college, a place where the dentists' kids go. That's how I've always thought of my college, is where the dentists and the local ministers send their kids to be dentists and local ministers. You know.
Are you still working?
Yeah, I work for county government. I've had a work life that has been extremely varied, although mostly in the last. I've mostly worked in the public sector. I've worked for labor unions. I've worked for community groups. I've worked for elected officials. I work kind of in the government bureaucracy now. But I feel very proud that I've gotten to do the stuff that I've wanted to do. I'm known to a few years ago. I worked with an organization called Citizens for Oregon's Future, where I got to go around and give presentations on tax and budget policy in the state. And I predict that at least a couple of your viewers say, he looks familiar. Oh, he's the one that came to our union hall and talked about how the property tax works. Yeah. So that was another of my identities.
So you wouldn't characterize yourself as being a Democrat or a Republican. Would you characterize yourself as a socialist or an independent, or what? Would you give yourself a name?
I'm a socialist.
Mm-hmm.
I am not a Republican. I am currently a member of the Democratic Party, but it's not the way I would define my political views. I've been careful over the years to sometimes say that I'm a socialist feminist, or I'm a democratic socialist, or I'm a democratic socialist feminist, and that would be the most accurate thing, because people have misconceptions about one of these various things, and I've always felt that capitalism and patriarchy were linked in their oppressive aspects, and that to really come to terms with the problems that both capitalism and patriarchy offers up to us, we have to see the connections between those things, as well as racism. I mean, capitalism, patriarchy, racism. Those are the problems over time. Those are the things that we have to confront.
I'm listening to you, but I want to remember what you said a few moments ago about a feminist, socialist, and all that kind of thing, because it's the first time I heard that. And do you mind if I characterize myself that way in the future sometime.
Please,
I like it.
please feel free. There's this new magazine that I discovered, and I can't pronounce it anyway. Jacobin. They reprinted this early 1970s essay that Barbara Ehrenreich wrote on socialist feminism, and it's really good. I had just, had heard about this from somebody, and I was thumbing through, and I had read it in the early 1970s, and it was great to read it again, because really a lot of my ideas came from stuff I read in the early 1970s.
And if I don't take a break, they're going to yell at me from the control room. But one more question before we take a break. Any names of people alive today or from the past that you particularly look up to or admire?
Oh, I'm a big fan of Woody Guthrie, because I think he really used art and social understanding to advance a progressive agenda in a way that that lives on today, even while a bunch of important books gather dust on the shelves. So I'm interested in the folks who have figured out how to be effective in that way.
Do you have a mate, boyfriend, girlfriend, wife,
I'm married.
husband?
I'm married. My wife Barbara is a librarian, and my son is going into his senior year at Cleveland High School. So I'm a dad, and he's a great guy.
Thanks for not yelling at me in there. You ready for a break? Okay, the mics will be off for a couple of minutes, and then we'll come back and talk about Okay, we are back. Thanks for staying tuned. And now, for you viewers who missed the opening of the show, Conversations with Dr. Don is an ongoing series of one-hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting people like most of you out there about who they are as unique, one-of-a-kind individuals, and about whatever it is that we have decided to talk about. And tonight we're talking about DSA, and we're about to talk about it, and things related to DSA and how we became involved. And let's just get started, okay? During the break, we were talking about how you guys got to know each other through DSA, and then we talked about how I knew you some years ago. I'm not good with years. How many years ago did I first meet you? Do you remember, Steve?
I cannot remember the first time that we met. I know it was somewhere around 2000 or 2001, but I can't remember how. I just can't remember, Don.
Yeah. I do know at the meetings, I was always so fascinated with you and whatever you had to say about whatever it is that was being discussed on the table. Your process and your thinking is a depth in you that I really admire. And I don't polish the apple too much, Steve. But anyhow, my impression of you. And the other day, there was a meeting, our first meeting in the Portland area at that church over there. And you two guys were there. And I didn't see you. I heard you making a comment now and then from the audience. But Peter got him, and I thought, who is that guy? The rich voice. And you are, I think, apparently also. So I've been looking forward to us talking some more and spending some more time together. And I hope we get DSA revived again. So shall we go from here and talk about DSA?
Let's talk about DSA.
Yeah, go ahead. Who will start? Who will start?
Well, I'll start if that's okay. So a little about DSA's origins. So we have to go back, I think, to 1972 and the Democratic Convention in 1972 and the choice of George McGovern as the Democratic candidate for president. That choice precipitated something that was probably boiling for a few years, at least anyway, in the Socialist Party of the United States. It precipitated a three-way split of the Socialist Party. And there are essentially three factions. The first faction, which some people have called the left-wing faction, was a faction led by David McReynolds, who I'm happy to say is still alive and kicking at the age of 83. These were the folks that wanted to stay in the old Socialist Party and to continue running candidates for office, including supporting a Socialist Party candidate for president. A second faction was called the centrist faction. And that faction was represented by Michael Harrington. And that faction very much wanted to support George McGovern for president in his race with Richard Nixon, because nobody was happy with what Nixon had been doing in the first 4 years, particularly in regard to foreign policy. And McGovern, in retrospect, from my point of view, is probably the most progressive candidate for president that Democrats have had.
He was a senator from what state?
South Dakota.
Yeah.
And Michael Harrington started the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, DSOC, a year later in 1973. The third faction was the right-wing faction in the Socialist Party, and yes, Virginia, there was a right-wing faction in the American Socialist Party. These folks were noteworthy for their strident and occasionally very shrill anti-communism and their Cold War hawkishness. They actually supported the Vietnam War and were leaning heavily towards supporting Richard Nixon because he was prosecuting the war. These included folks like George Meany and Lane Kirkland of the AFL-CIO, Sidney Hook, the philosopher, Max Shachtman, who used to be a Trotskyite and migrated during the course of his life to the political right. And so those folks started Social Democrats USA. That organization still exists. You can find them on the internet. I think they've traded their Cold War hawkishness for war on terror hawkishness. So I don't think they've changed all that much.
You've really kept up with things through the
Well, I
years.
did a little boning up for this show, too.
Good.
So cut to 10 years later. And Michael Harrington helps broker a partnership between his Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee and an organization called the New American Movement, which originated in 1971, a year before the split in the Socialist Party. NAM was a solid left-wing organization. They started all sorts of things around the country. One of them were a series of schools in major metropolitan areas, including Portland. Yes, the New American Movement started the Red Rose School. And as you know, Don, it was my privilege to be on the Red Rose School Committee for its last 6 years.
Yeah.
And so NAM and DSOC formed into Democratic Socialists of America.
What does NAM mean?
And that New American Movement.
Yes, okay.
And that was in 1982. So DSA has been around now for 31 years, if I have my math correct.
Now let me just throw in
Please.
One more footnote to Steve's excellent history of sort of where DSOC came from, because I was involved in the New American Movement in the 1970s, and just like DSOC, the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, came out of an official split in the Socialist Party. The New American Movement came out of sort of an unofficial split in a new left organization called Students for Democratic Society, the SDS. And the most famous faction that came out of the SDS was the Weather Underground, that was involved in doing various terrorist acts and what have you. The split that became the New American Movement that came out of a socialism feminism conference that was organized in Minneapolis, and they were people, the leaders were people who'd been in the SDS but had gotten involved in doing community work and also had been taking steps to confront what was sexism in the leadership of the SDS. There was a lot of, in the movements of the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of real male dominance, and women are going to make the cookies, and some of these women said, the hell we are. And it was also, the other thing that I think really helped New American movement get started was the emergence after the Stonewall riots of gay lesbian leadership. And then those folks from the SDS were joined by people older leftists who had been part of the Communist Party until the Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia. And they had left, and it turned out that all of these folks had a similar sort of politics that included an emphasis on doing sort of work in communities, in the same way that the Black Panthers at that time were doing breakfast programs, very much into that, and into linking the fights for feminism against racism with the fight against capitalism. And so, and the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee their members were older and tended to be more established. The New American Movement folks tended to be younger and more involved in community activities, more involved in organizing stuff, so it was an interesting coming together. I was there for the unity event.
I would add one other antecedent. I think we should also recall the Port Huron Statement.
Oh, yeah.
Written in 1962 by, among others, Tom Hayden,
right,
which pretty much set the stage for the creation of Students for a Democratic Society.
Yes. And his whole economic democracy platform was very, very similar to what we were working with.
Yeah. So there's history and heritage here.
And Michael Lerner, who was involved with those folks, he's gone on to
become a rabbi and now associated with Tikkun, who has been very good on most everything, actually, but particularly the Middle East stuff.
Right. But he did really good theoretical work on what it would mean to be sort of a popular activist organization.
Yeah.
So then I think about Cornel West and a few other names that are members today of DSA, and I'm wondering the well-known, famous people who are with the DSA, is there a common thread among them? They're certainly not rightists for the most part, and they're not radical or leftists to that part. How would you characterize that group of people? Or is there one way of describing all of them?
No, I don't think so. I've got a collection of DSA. DSA publishes Democratic Left as a quarterly magazine.
Yeah.
And I've got Democratic Left stuff going back to '84. I've just kept them, each issue that I've gotten. And in reading those issues for over the years, I would say DSA is a very interesting collection of socialists that range from, on one end of the spectrum, fairly solid Marxists who are not particularly favorable toward private enterprise or private profit in a socioeconomic system, to, on the other hand, what I would call mixed economy socialists. Harold Meyerson immediately comes to mind, the left writer on the political left for the Washington Post. He's really the only one they have, I think, as a columnist. And also, I don't know whether he still is, but editor for many years of the LA Weekly. And by mixed economy socialists, folks who favor some private profit enterprises within a society with heavy regulation of profits through taxation and other means, as well as advanced social welfare systems. And so there's a mixture of both in DSA, which is what I've always liked about DSA. The fact that we could actually have those folks under the same umbrella has always been fairly impressive to me. I mean, one of the things NAM brought to DSA, as Rhys, indicated, was a solid left-wing point of view. A number of former communists like Dorothy Healy and Ben Dobbs in California, and probably in other major American cities too, there were former communists who came into DSA through the NAM-DSAC merger. I think that was very important for DSA, a kind of left-wing ecumenical point of view, if you will. And so it's one of the things that attracted me to DSA. What also attracted me is that there were so many noteworthy leftists whose work I had read, who had cycled in and sometimes out of DSA over the 29 years that I've been members. I made a list of all of them. It's fairly long, and it's very impressive.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I'd like to emphasize what Steve said is that DSA, in comparison with other explicitly socialist organizations, particularly DSA is pluralist. That means that there is not a line that you have to sign on that you believe this and this and this and this and that. It's more about an approach. And if you look at the practice of DSA, there's a lot of working in coalitions and working with other groups. There's not the idea that we have a monopoly on the truth, and if you don't agree with every T, cross the T and dot the I's, that you're not okay. I think we welcome a variety of folks. So another example I'd give is the approach to electoral work. There are DSA members who are elected Democrats in the Congress, like John Conyers is an example.
Yes.
Very, very progressive guy, and there are a lot of the DSA chapter in Detroit does a lot of support for John Conyers' work. In New England, they're big on Bernie Sanders. Now, he's an elected official, but he's not a Democrat.
Independent.
But in every third-party movement that's come along, from the various forms of labor parties to the Citizens Party, Barry Commoner years ago, New American Movement had a lot of folks involved in that Citizens Party movement. I think Democratic Socialists of America has been involved in the Working Families Party and other third-party movements. But then there are also folks who wouldn't go near a ballot box if you shoved it in front of them, because they don't view that as being real political work. And there's room for all of those people to work together.
So you think the DSA membership now, by and large, could come together enough to offer a significant alternative to the existing monopoly capitalism model that we're following in this country and around the world, for that matter?
I would characterize it as a series of alternatives and not a single alternative. I mean, the good news is nobody's going to force us to agree to a single alternative, because it'd be kind of theoretical right now. But
sure.
But I think that there's a lot of agreement on things that are wrong, and there are a lot of different paths on how we get out of here, and who really can say that they've got a monopoly on how to do that. I mean, I think if any of us knew exactly how to do it, we'd be doing it, wouldn't we?
So, Don, one of the things I wanted to point it out is that DSA is part of a very long tradition, and it's a worldwide tradition.
Yes.
And there is a worldwide organization of organizations that are socialist or social democratic organizations. It's called the Socialist International. It's been around at least since the 19th century. And I just recently researched it on the internet, and DSA is the only member organization of the Socialist International from the United States. We are now the sole representative. Some years ago, Social Democrats USA actually had membership, but that was discontinued somewhere along the line. Just to give you an example of some more familiar countries, the representative from Canada is the New Democratic Party, which has for a long time been the left-wing Democratic Party in Canada. Here's something interesting. The British Labour Party used to be a member organization. It has now changed its status to an observing member of the Socialist International. I'm not absolutely sure why, but it wouldn't surprise me if that's the effect New Labour has had on the Labour Party, and Tony Blair in particular, and through Tony Blair, perhaps even Bill Clinton, since the two of them were thick as thieves. So, and interestingly enough, Sweden and Denmark are full members, but Norway has become an observing member. And I'd love to know the story behind that, because the Scandinavian countries, you know, are known for their advanced social welfare systems and their strong socialist and social democratic parties. So at any rate, I mean, you know, I mean, so many countries in the world have fairly large and significant socialist and social democratic parties. One of the questions intellectuals have been asking for years in this country was why there never was a significant socialist movement. The most significant movement we had was one that began in the late 19th century and probably ended when Norman Thomas made the terrible mistake of becoming a pacifist at precisely the wrong time in world history.
Yeah. Speaking of spirituality, Norman Thomas was the socialist candidate for president. He was a Presbyterian minister, and he had, you know, those were his values. That was what was most important to him. And I totally agree with Steve. It was tactically not the greatest thing for the Socialist Party, but there were a lot of factors there. The tension between the socialists and communists, and all of that stuff, which has gone on for years and years. And the U.S. left has always been incredibly fractious. People fighting with each other. But even though so many of us are working for the same things. I mean, if you look at what DSA is working on around the country, there are issues that are familiar to any progressive. Health care, against war, for immigration reform, for basic human rights. I mean, those are the things that.
If somebody asked me why I was a socialist, the answer that I would give was, I prefer a system based on cooperation and compassion to a system based on cold-heartedness and competition. And the former is socialism and the latter is capitalism.
But aren't there different kinds of socialism and different kinds of capitalism? Because could there be a form of capitalism that is, what's the word I want to use, that is caring and concerned about social welfare and justice and still call itself capitalism?
So far as I know, the Scandinavian countries still regard themselves as capitalist countries with very advanced social welfare systems and high taxation. If the United States had become Swedenized or Denmarkized by the time I died, I'd be happy, considering what I've been through in my 70 years in this life in this country. But if I were living in those countries, I'd be on the political left of the socialist parties in those countries and be fighting for against the injustices that are there, because those countries are not paradises. They have their problems too.
Are we going to see the day when people look at the term socialist and the communist and recognize there's a difference between the two, or will we ever come to that pass here in America?
I have my doubts whether communism can be reinvented. The history of it, thanks mostly to Stalin, would seem to me to make that unlikely. But I think we are already seeing polling results from Gallup, of all people, showing that younger people are much more favorably inclined to socialism than ever before, upwards of 30%.
I think that the growing income inequality in our country is going to make people look at things in very different ways. And I think it's unpredictable, but I think it's certainly possible that a growing number of folks will say, this is just fundamentally wrong. And that may be something that'll help us turn the corner.
And we're going to have to stop before they yell at me from the control room. Before we say goodnight, I want to thank my wonderful crew and you guests for coming on. And I wonder if you have one more quick message for a few seconds that you want to give the audience about your experience on this show tonight. Who will say something first?
Well, I had a good time tonight. I just want to say that one of my favorite adages, to degenderize it, is from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. One of the great socialists, Karl Marx, said that in, I believe, the Gotha program.
You have 10 seconds, Rhys.
Get up off the sofa, get out on the street, make social change. Let's do it.
Yeah, so let's have a few public service announcements before we stop. To get my show, local broadcast schedule, go to my website and click on present day activities, and then you can see when to watch my show other times. And to watch my shows on the web, go to www.donbaham.com and click on favorite links. Next, the ACLU. Oh, the American Civil Liberties Union. Without the ACLU, I think our civil liberties would be totally in the tank rather than in serious trouble as they are right now. My show is broadcast by the stations. Ask your local public access station to go to pegmedia.org and follow instructions on how to have that local broadcast station broadcast my shows from other parts of the country. Ending corporate personhood. We've got to end corporate personhood. Go to movetoamend.org and end corporate personhood so we can save this wonderful experiment called America. Thank you. My final message, rest in peace, poor people's president, Hugo Chavez, a hero of mine. Thanks for watching, and remember, KFC, not bad KFC, Dr. Don's KFC. Kind, friendly, and charitable. Be kind, be friendly, and be charitable. To you too. And you too, and you too, and you too. Thanks again for watching. See you next time.